Thanks to Cami for a great presentation and Andrea for moderating. I'd like to welcome you all to our third concurrent session for the equity track. For those who stayed with us, thanks for being here. And for those who are just joining us, welcome. If you are interested in the concurrent talks at this time for the clinical or global tracks, please return to the agenda page on the SpotMe conference platform and navigate to those agenda items. This third session about the Center for Health Equity at the American Medical Association, or AMA, will be presented by Dr. Derige. Before I introduce Dr. Derige, just a few reminders. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to enter your questions into the chat. Also, just a reminder that you will be able to return to the conference platform for a month after the conference to watch sessions that you miss and access resources shared during the presentations. If you have further questions or want to connect with Dr. Derige after this presentation, you can send her an email and I will be making her contact available in the chat. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Derige. Dr. Derige holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and women's studies and a master's degree in public health from the University of Michigan, as well as a doctor of public health from the University of North Carolina. She's the Director of Health Equity Strategy and Development at the American Medical Association's Center for Health Equity, which aims to embed health equity across the AMA so that health equity becomes part of the practice, process, action, innovation, and organizational performance and outcomes. Over the past 20 years, she has designed and managed several private, philanthropic, governmental, and nonprofit programs, and has concentrated throughout her career on promoting public health and social equity for marginalized communities. In addition to her work at the AMA, Dr. Derige is currently adjunct faculty at the University of North Carolina Gilling School of Global Public Health and has held positions as co-director of the Center for Latina Maternal and Family Health Research at the University of Houston, program officer at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and the Chicago Community Trust, and National Director of MCH Initiatives at Urban Strategies. So with that, I will hand things over to Dr. Derige. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'd like to thank everyone on this conference for joining me today, and I would love to thank the team that's helping me out. I am coming to you live from vacation, and so, of course, all things being equal, of course, I have internet connection issues. But I'm happy to be here with you. These are my slides, and you'll hear me ask for next slides when appropriate. I'm here to talk to you about the embedding racial justice and advanced health equity work of the American Medical Association, as facilitated by the Center of Health Equity, of which I am a vice president of Health Equity Strategy. Those of you who might be in the know that we released our strategic plan to embed health equity at AMA. It was a 2.5 year in the process making that plan. It was released last week, May 11th, and I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the pieces of that work and where we're kind of moving towards. As you can imagine, any of your organizations who have gone through racial equity work, health equity work, know that it is a long process. It is not an administrative function. That being said, it is even most so important for systematic organizations, legacy organizations with long histories like the AMA to go through this process and really understand and embrace the work of health equity. So with that being said, next slide. We start all of our work out with land and labor acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are living off the stolen ancestral lands of Indigenous people for thousands of years. We acknowledge the extraction of brilliance, energy, and life and labor forced upon people of African descent and other migrant and other communities across the world for more than 400 years. We celebrate the resilience and strength of all the Indigenous peoples and their descendants of Africa and have shown for the country and worldwide. And we carry our ancestors with us, and we continually call to them to make it better and help us lead us in our work. I told you I come from vacation, so I am on the homelands of the Calusa tribes of Western Florida. And so I recognize that I sit on occupied lands that were taken from people. The importance of this is the truth telling and changing dominant narratives. And so we always begin with these kinds of acknowledgments so that we understand how we're centering stories and how we're centering narrative. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. Next slide. So You've seen this slide before. You've seen variations of this. This isn't the all-encompassing slide. There are some things that need to happen differently in this. But the idea is that equality, everyone gets what they need. Equity is making sure that people get what they need to succeed for their optimal experience. Then we have the reality of it. And then the idea of what we could think of a world without that, right? The liberations of these systematic inequities moving forward. Next slide. And so when we look at this slide, we're talking about what creates health. So this is our framework, and one of the frameworks we'll talk about, one of the theories we talk about understanding health. And so for the Center of Health Equity and the work that we do, and working at AMA, is we're really moving to these ideas of upstream. What is happening upstream? What are the root causes of health inequities that we see in the world today? How they are institutionalized and become systemic in our systems, and then trickle down into the living conditions that we all experience, right? We know that health is where you work, live, play, worship, and grow. And so how does the systemic inequities create these infrastructures, create our new realities? Then we know that the risk behaviors add to that. And where medicine often comes in, right? Organized healthcare is in this downstream disease and injury, right? How do we solve for the acute issues that we're facing at the moment? And then the mortality, right? Inequitable distribution of mortality and morbidity. The work of health equity really requires us to think upstream, right? We cannot solve at the downstream level. We can treat, we must put out the fire, and we must also think about what is causing the fire and how do we get at that root cause. Next slide. And so this work was something that Dr. Jim Madera, who is our CEO at AMA, decided that we needed to embrace as an organization. And it wasn't just Dr. Madera as CEO. The Center for Health Equity was created by our House of Delegates policy. So there was a voting policy that said that AMA needs to create a center or like place that really looks at health equity and how it can be part of American medicine. And so under Dr. Madera's leadership, we organized the Center for Health Equity in 2019. Next slide. And immediately what we realized is that health equity was a strategic arc of the AMA, right? And what does that mean? So we have three strategic arcs. One of them is innovation, advocacy. The second is advocacy, and the third is equity. Or you can say the first is equity, advocacy, and innovation. The idea is that we need all of these things to make our work, which is leading the charge to confront chronic disease and public health crises, driving the future of medicine, and removing obstacles that interfere with patient care. In order to accomplish these goals, we need to have these accelerators of equity. Equity needs to move through all of our work. Advocacy, right, is another arm of the AMA, needs to move through all of our work, and innovation. And they need to work together in order to optimize our mission and vision in our work that we see. Next slide. So that's no easy feat. And so one of the things we included in our strategic plan was this timeline of the equity work only from 1995 to 2020. And it's been an arc even at that point, right? I told you that in 2019, the Center for Equity was created. We had some policies that also recognized racism as a public health threat in this last year. We also talked about police brutality. So we've been on this arc of working towards what could be equitable practices. And part of that is developing statements and policies that recognize it, right? And putting our line in the sand because we recognize our power and privilege as the American Medical Association, as a membership organization, the largest membership organization of physicians and medical students with over 270,000 members. And that is key to why we do that our work, right? It is important that our membership understand this, that they embrace it, but also as an institution of the 1,100 employees at AMA also has the foundational work to be able to move this forward. Next slide. So what does that look like? So in 2019, the Center of Equity was created, and our mission really is to strengthen, amplify, sustain AMA's work to eliminate health inequities, improving health outcomes and closing disparities gaps, and this is the key part, right? I just said, which are rooted in historical and contemporary oppressive systems of power and structural injustices such as racism, exclusion, and discrimination. We recognize that these inequities didn't come out of anywhere, right? We recognize that these inequities are not biological. You've heard this said before, no doubt in this conference, but most recently is that race is not a determining factor, right? Race is not what kills, right? Racism is what racism is. And so I think that is really important. The 5 approaches that we have taken on this work to facilitate AMA's work, right? The Center of Health Equity is not required to do it. It's helping facilitate this. We do this through embedding equity in practice, process, action, innovation of the organization performance and outcomes, build alliances and share power via meaningful engagement, ensure equitable opportunities and conditions in innovations, recognizing that innovation, again, is another one of those accelerators. And innovation in health is a fast-moving train, so we must be able to support marginalized, minoritized people and communities, both in centering their voices and the need for innovation, healthcare innovation, but also investing in those innovators from those communities. Pushing upstream, we talked about upstream work and how it's important to understand addressing all determinants of health. And then an important one that starts at the end, but really is wrapped up in all of this, is creating pathways to truth, reconciliation, racial healing, and transformation. Next slide. So the theories that really bring us to this work are really writing the injustices of the past, challenging malignant, which are our dominant narratives most in this country, centering the voices of those most marginalized, adopting a race and an intersectional understanding. So we start with race and embracing public health frameworks, and then also looking in the inside outside, right? So are we doing the work on ourselves? Then we also have to support what's happening on the outside. We do that through our 3 levels, and we call it our membership, which is inclusive of all of its staff, right? It's not just the management per se at AMA. It's our 1,100 staff who help develop the policies, who help support the functions of the American Medical Association. Our membership, 270,000 members plus, that they have the adequate tools and resources to carry this work out. And then the field of medicine, recognizing as a legacy institution that we grew up with the same racist systemic systems as the US and have helped perpetuate them in many senses. So what is our role in American medicine and globally to stand up for those and recognize our work in equity? And we look to really AMA becoming an anti-racist, diverse, and multicultural organization. And how we do that is by embedding anti-racism, diversity, and belonging in a multicultural organizational principles in the organization. And if we can accomplish, or I should say, when we accomplish those things, we can advance health equity as an organization and support the country in doing that work as well. Next slide. We also recognize that AMA has some really specific levers, right? It has its relationships, partnerships, and networks, data used, research, publication, policy and advocacy work, education, training and tools, programs and products, communication and content. This is really important for any organization that is going through this work. What are the levers you use, right, to implement any of your work? If you can name them, that is where health equity should be found, right? It should be omnipresent and also focused. You should ask yourself, how does equity show up here? What is missing from this conversation? And so again, across our strategic approaches, using these levers of change to get our work done. Next slide. And again, this is how we look at this work, our organizational commitment and equity outputs. Add them to our levers of change, gives us our short-term impacts and then our long-term impacts that we're trying to do. And long-term is these 5+ years out. And the first 1 to 2 years is really setting the framework about embedding the work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The 3 years is looking at our short-term impacts. Are we getting to where we need to be? Next slide. And so this is an important quote that we have from Alice Walker that helps us center what we're talking about, right? You've heard this, many people of us talk about this. You can't go into somebody else's house and tell them how messy their kitchen is if yours isn't cleaned up, right? No one who lives in a glass house should throw stones. Same kind of concepts. We'll be really misled if we think we can change society without changing ourselves. Next slide. So I'll jump right into what we call embed equity, right? Our policy and programming, everything that we do and say, our foundational understanding of how equity works, how inequities work, how structural racism affect health and healthcare. This is a key concept for an organization, for its staff to understand and to embrace, because they will have to be the backbone of this. Anybody who's implementing this work needs to have this foundational understanding. It won't be easy. Everyone doesn't start at the same place, but it's work that needs to be done. Next slide. And so this is our embed change theory, right? Organizational alignment, capacity building. We have organizational commitment from leadership. We have workforce and equity competencies, engagement and partnerships, publishing, advocacy, internal and external communication and marketing, data collection, budget, contracts, innovation. All those things that we do at the AMA, again, have to have equity run through them. And then we have to have practice outcomes. We need to know what we're doing. First, we need to know what we're doing and then be able to measure it. But we also have to have principles and policies to do that. And we become a multicultural racist justice organization and improve health outcomes to close the gaps. Next slide. So we work off this model that comes out of the GARE as part of the Race Forward model of normalize, organize, and operationalize, right? We need to normalize, again, the foundational understandings of what systemic oppression looks like. We need to organize around that so we can develop solutions, and then we need to operationalize those solutions and move forward. In order to do all of that, we need to visualize. Important to this work, and anybody who's done this work in your organizations know that we also need to create trauma-informed supports. And this is often because for those who are most impacted by this kind of work, this kind of realization work through embedding is really fundamental, that they have the supports they need to not be re-traumatized, right? That if we're talking about the social unrest and the violence and the killing of and the murders of Black people at the hands of the police, that people aren't re-traumatized. We can discuss that. We need to discuss it. We need to realize it, and we need to be able to provide support so people can have these conversations in safe places, that they can get the supports they need to have that. Next slide. And then again, you've heard this before, this diversity inclusion. As we think about equity, we think about fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for individuals. Diversity and inclusion, diversity means that you have a diverse group. Inclusion means that you're invited to the party. Equity is really about getting the needs met, right? To meet all people where they're at. Next slide. So we had started with, and this is one of the organizations we work with, is the Racial Equity Institute, to again send that foundational training that helps us understand and discuss. So from our management, our senior management, to our board of trustees, to our administrative staff, everyone is invited to attend and expected to be part of this work. Next slide. So part of this work is understanding dominant narratives, and that's what we talked about before, these malignant conversations, right? And what does that mean? People are always like, why are dominant narratives malignant, right? Dominant narratives are those things that are embedded in our institutions, our culture, and they represent the voices and are reinforcing the social relationships and generation of social, political, and economic inequity, right? The thing about dominant narratives, right, and this is often is like, in the breastfeeding world, I don't have a lactation consultant that speaks my language or understands my experience. And people will say, or they did at one time, why is that important, right? Because that narrative tells me that there aren't people that look like me and have my same experience that are doing this. What dominant narratives do, the malignancy part of this, is they affect and obscure power and responsibility. Who is responsible for that? They divide populations with common concerns, they enforce compliance, and they ensure that opposing visions of society's future do not become reality. And that is really important to this work. Next slide. So again, narratives reflect the values and shape our beliefs. They often talk about like it's not written anywhere, right? It's just something I was taught. It's just something I experienced and looked at. Racial and class inequalities are unfortunate, but they're not necessarily unjust, right? We think of things as individual narratives, that person did something wrong to experience the misfortune they have. They don't care. It's not as important to them. Self-determining individuals make right and wrong lifestyle choices, right? Rendering political, structural, social determinants and health inequities visible. They chose not to do that, as opposed to they did not have the resources available for them because they have been systemically excluded from programming, because their communities have been disinvested in systemically. Pick ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? This mediocrity, this idea that you have to do everything by yourself, that somehow everyone who's made it or achieved anything did it by their own free will and not with anything, no other systems were in place. American exceptionalism, if you gain, I lose, the zero-sum game. And then the hierarchy of human value based on skin, white supremacy, right? This is the racist model that race is a social construct, and the hierarchy of human value is based on that. Next slide. So we have to think about this also in this arc. And I started with our land and labor acknowledgement. Even though I stumbled through it, I started with it. But this idea that we need to recognize where we are in time. right? And so we talk about American slavery lasting over 250 years, segregation, another 90 plus years, and then where we are today, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act, and where we are today. And this movement that we are part of. And that's a long arc. We've heard this before, to justice, but we are on this thing and we must continue and understand where we are and how that narrative changes. Next slide. So you can hit the forward button again. So we talk about bias and blind spots, and then we all have them, right? So it's part of the things that I shared with you is that when we talk about health equity, we talk about equity work. It's not a checklist form, right? We constantly have to evolve in it. Those of you who've been in this work for a long time, remember when we talked about cultural competency, and then we talked about cultural proficiency, and now we're talking about making sure that programming is there's cultural safety in our programs. And the idea is that we're evolving to understand the intricacies, the interdependentness of this work, and that is important. So we all must continue to be on this journey as our language expands, as our understanding expands. Next slide. And this tells you about the blind spots, right? The intersectionality of people. People exist in communities with life stories and with their own experiences, good and bad. And so understanding how those things interplay are really key to helping support people get what they need, right? To develop equity, to get what they need to have their optimal health. Next slide. Keep one more time. So the commitment to organization, so this is an organizational slide that I thought to put in because it is not by happenstance, right? You cannot just develop a training and say, we're all going to go to it, we're all going to develop it. There needs to be accountability, right? There needs to be inclusion, there needs to be feedback loops that make it important. It needs to be in your planning and development, it needs to be in review, it needs to be in the implementation. There needs to be alignment by management, and there needs to be consultation by those who are operationalizing this work. This is key. And while this diagram isn't pretty, it is really important that we can track it and follow the work. Because when you embed equity to build sustainability, it must become, again, ingrained in your systems. It must be something that happens all the time. It is what we do and how we do. We recognize who has not been at the table, what voices are not heard, how we're not meeting our optimal goals, and we are taking action to do that. Next slide. And so when we operationalize, how do we ensure these efforts? We talk about what's the data we're using, what does the data tell us, what data are missing. I often ask, why are we asking that kind of data? Is it answering the question we need to? Can we change how we're thinking about the question and the data? How have communities, physicians, or patients been engaged? Are there opportunities for an expand engagement? Who benefits and who will be burdened by what we're doing? Who holds the decision-making power and the privilege? And are there opportunities to share power? How will you ensure accountability and communicate and evaluate results? All of those are important to this work of understanding, operationalizing, and the embedment of equity. Next slide. So the next one we talked about was push upstream, right? Next slide. The idea again, and this is a chart that really came from Dr. Williams et al., and it really talks about chronic stress and racism, right? And you can see and follow the patterns about how we get to inequities. And there's these differential living condition, different vascular resources. Racism has affected both of them on the front end and currently at the same time. Chronic stress, epigenetic, increased allostatic load, and health inequities. Again, this is the point that health inequities isn't an individual decision, right? There are health risk behaviors that have many influences of why we do what we do. But there's also structural systems at play that complicate and make it very important that we understand these intricacies. Next slide. And so when we talk about moving upstream, we think about population health, management and medicine, community health, and then societal public health, right? And we have been in one of the greatest moments of societal public health with this generation, with COVID-19. Understanding that what happens to those around us is keenly important to our own health. Literally, we are all in this together. And what does it mean? And it has been a hard lesson to learn, and it's taught us a lot about how we think as Americans, as society, about the health of others as it relates to our own health. Next slide. And so how we've looked at it with how we have operationalized it at this moment with the push upstream work is not only centering public health frameworks, but also investing in our communities, right? How do we come to the table with our resources at AMA? And for the first time in its history, AMA has invested in its own backyard 2 years ago with Westside United, which is a collaborative effort of people, organizations, and work to really reduce what is a life expectancy gap from It's a 16-year difference from the Gold Coast, where AMA is located, to the west side of Chicago. And many of you have the same kind of stratified. Where you live determines how long you live. So there's a 16-year life expectancy from the Gold Coast area in Chicago, where AMA is, right outside where AMA is, to the west side, which is historically under-resourced community, right, systemically, and there are Black and Brown BIPOC communities in this area. Westside United has brought people together to be part of reducing that and also building economic vitality. AMA believed that that was part of our work and how we could do that. So we do both our programming, right? We do hypertension programming, but we also became part of social impact investment, putting in $2 million over 2 years with this larger group of social impact investors to invest in economic development, job training, um, building of mixed use housing. There's many things we built in to be able to support communities because we realized that health wasn't just, is there a clinic there, right? That access is one part of healthcare, but the larger part is how can communities help to support, how can we help communities where they're at, build their resources and change their trajectory. Next slide. So the next one we're going to go through is ensure, and this is the innovation, right? Ensure equity and innovation. Next slide. And we recognize what we didn't know. Part of your equity work is recognizing what you don't know. And part is that we didn't know this field as well as we wanted to in-house. We didn't have the experience. So we brought in an external equity and innovation advisor group. They support problem solving, decision making, stakeholder engagement, collaboration. There's quarterly meetings. And these are some of our amazing stakeholders. They are at the forefront of this work. They have been in it for years, many of them, as BIPOC representatives in healthcare innovation, and have both firsthand experience, but also experience in this kind of larger atmosphere of equity. How do we build this? What's needed? Again, it is important that we center voices of those most marginalized and minoritized. Go to the people who are experiencing this work, right? To understand what is needed, not developing solutions in a vacuum. Next slide. This is building partnerships and alliances. Next slide. And so one of the things that we started 2 years ago is the Release the Pressure Project, which really is looking at hypertension and high blood pressure prevalence in the African American adults, specifically centering the work on Black women. What do we know and where do we need to support them? How do we meet Black women where they are? How does the AMA become a trusted resource? Who do we need to work with? So part of this work was developing a coalition. We have a coalition for Release the Pressure of the American Medical Association, the Association of Black Cardiologists, the National Medical Association, the American Heart Association, the Marty Health Institute, to name a few. And so we worked in our first year, inaugural year last year, with Essence Media to really develop programming that met women where they were, understood all of the things that were in their lives that created pressure and were barriers and limitations to their own well-being, and began to create programming that supported them. Next slide. And again, we took what we knew about blood pressure control and we said, how do we make it easy for the consumer to understand? Set a BP goal with a healthcare professional, monitor your BP at home, activate a wellness plan, and make a self-care a group thing. And number 4 is really about squad care. We can't do this alone, right? So again, building alliances with groups that are trusted allies in this work, that have firsthand experience, have the cultural relevance and sensitivity and proficiency in this work, and building out a plan from there to support communities and be part of the solution and not just building, as they say, building the baseball field and hoping people will come. Next slide. One of the other things we're doing is understand that we need a cohort of health equity experts and advocacy amongst physicians groups. And so we are working with the Satcher Health Leadership Institute at the Morehouse School of Medicine for the Medical Justice and Advocacy Fellows. We're going to identify physician leaders and communities seeking to advance racial health justice in local communities and provide fellows with ongoing support to engage institutions. This will be an 18-month program. We're looking to have the inaugural class have 10 fellows. We will be announcing in the next 2 weeks our inaugural fellows, and we had an amazing pool of applicants the first round. For 10 spots, of some of the most creative and innovative physician thinkers out there. So, which is also invigorating to know that there are people out here who want to do this work and get connected and build a healthier future. Next slide. So this is at the end, the idea of fostering truth, racial healing, reconciliation, and transformation. As we developed our work, as we built out our strategic plan, it became evident to us that the fostering work is both the beginning and the end, right? If you think about this work, this is where it all starts, is this idea of that there has to be truth telling, there has to be reconciliation, there has to be acknowledgement, and then there has to be transformation to something else. And the transformation of those all things. So we end with it because we think it is very powerful, but we also which is we talked about. Next slide. So again, this came from the National Health Equity Collaborative, really to undo the brief and hierarchy of human value, racism, and to replace it with the capacity to see ourselves and one another. So we really talk about TRH in the traditional forms of how do we do our truth telling, right? As part of our first step, how do we do our racial healing and reconciliation, and how do we move forward with transformation? Next slide. And so this has been and continues to be one of those things. We're again, I want to remind you, we are a legacy institution, and our systems grew up with the American values system as well, and been part of and perpetuators of many malignant narratives. So no set of commitments of anti-racism can begin without an honest assessment of an institution's own history and present practices. We talked about the early years following the Civil War, how AMA declined to embrace policy of non-discrimination and excluded integrated local medical societies through selective enforcement of membership. We also looked at, so these are some key points. In the 1870s through the late 1960s, the AMA failed to take action against AMA-affiliated state and local medical society associations that openly practiced racial exclusion in their membership, which had direct impact on physicians receiving hospital privileges of where they could practice. So again, perpetuating the exclusion of Black physicians and Black patients from quality care. In the early decades of the 20th century, the AMA listed Black physician as colored in our national registry, which slowed to remove the designation in response to protests by the National Medical Association. So we had to be called out, right, by our sister organization, the National Medical Association, for doing this because it was a way to label and categorize people in order, again, to identify them. The Flexner Report of 1910, commissioned by the AMA's Council of Medical Education, was meant to get the quackery out of medicine, and was supported by private philanthropic funding to kind of make medicine more rigor. And in its own systemic racism and development at that point, it really contributed to the closure of 5 of the 7 Black medical schools and all 3 of the women's schools that were available in this country at this time. It just had profound impact on the number of the Black physicians that we have in the workforce today. And one can point to the reflection and the increased morbidity and mortality we have in our communities. The AMA was silent in the debates of the civil rights of 1964 and put off repeated NMA requests to support efforts to embed the Hill-Burton Act's separate but equal provision. So that's just some of the things. Next slide. So those are some of the things that people bring up. We also have a really long history. One of AMA's former president was J. Marion Sims, and those of you here who do maternal and child health work know about the horrific experiments, or may have heard of the horrific experiments he had done on Black enslaved women, right? Without not only their permission, acknowledgement as them as human beings, but without any anesthetic, right? And so for many years, he was considered, many centuries, many decades, was considered the godfather of gynecology. But at what cost, right? Again, changing these narratives and understanding the suffering and who was harmed for this. Next slide. So we also talked about the Flexner Report and what that had, and we have had studies about the projected estimates of what it meant for the closure of historically Black colleges and how they're still building up from historic lows, right? And what that means for their endowments and who they are as organizations and what our support is, right? And our role in that. Next slide. So we've made some progress, and we showed you the timeline at the beginning, and we're still moving to it. Passed and adopted policies in the fall of 2020, right? Our most recent meeting. That racism is a public health threat. We announced that we should rid our healthcare system of racial essentialism, recognize that race is a social, not a biological construct, and to support the elimination of race as a proxy for ancestry, genetics, biology, and medical education, research, and clinical practices. This is key because this is our House of Delegates. This is our membership saying, this is how we're moving forward. This is what we're going to do. We need to make this real in American medicine. Next slide. AMA also didn't, it took till 2008, but offered an apology to the National Medical Association for its exclusion, right? And it recognized very importantly that this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. So the idea was that it was important that this apology happened, and it's our step forward, right? It's the truth. It is not yet the reconciliation. It is not yet the transformation that we needed. And that took till 2008 when we had to, when AMA as an organization made that apology. Next slide. So most recently, and some of you may have heard of this and some of you may have not, is that the father of AMA, and the founding editor of JAMA, there's a whole, I'm sure many of you have heard all about what's going on with JAMA, Nathan Davis, explicitly excluded women and Black physicians from the representation of the House of Delegates, thus appeasing many state and local medical societies and barred all but white men from their memberships. The other part is that we had a bust in a predominant part of our building. And Dr. Madera, once understanding the history of this, right, because part of it is like, what is the truth telling? What do we know? Had the bust and display Davis removed from public view and placed in our archives. We cannot erase it from our history. That's not the point. The part is to understand the complicated history. Again, it's the truth telling, right? So that we can have the conversations, right? They're small steps, but they're necessary steps. And that is where we're moving towards. Our strategic plan is not the end. As I told you, it took us 2.5 years in the making. It is the beginning. It is not all encompassing. It will evolve just like our work does. And that's what you should know is when you go into this equity work, that work will continually evolve. And you must understand that and be part of that process. Next slide. And so I'm going to end with this is that leadership and accountability is key to all of this work, right? Your organizations must commit to this work. Your senior leadership must, that your membership must understand to be part of it. That doesn't mean that other people get training. That doesn't mean you develop things for your clients. It means that you embrace this work because you understand that you are part of the system. You're part of these dominant narratives, and it's key for you to do this work. Since we live in an age in which silence is not only criminal but suicidal, I have been making as much noise as possible. So I'll end with the James Baldwin speech.
Thanks, Dr. Derige, for that great presentation. We have a few questions that appeared in the chat, so we'll just jump right in. You spoke some about the Medical Equity Fellowship Program, but we had a question from Nikki Lee specifically about education of students. She said, if we can't make breastfeeding education routine and ubiquitous in medical schools, how will health equity education become so? How is the AMA working to be sure that all medical students receive education and clinical practice in health equity?
Yeah, so we've actually worked with, we have a whole medical education division. So we have worked to both assess what is happening in the schools and how we can support, including the creation of structural competencies. And part of that is equity competencies, racial equity competencies, to understand how inequities are formed. So the idea is, and breastfeeding is not that much different, right? Because it has been considered not a science, right? This is other things. And so I think that is a really important question. And the question is again, how do we get rid of these dominant narratives of what is important? When you get rid of the quackery of science, it's kind of the same thing about being colorblind. The idea is that I don't understand or really care about your pain. I'm just going to pretend like everything is equal. And we know this for many years as females out there, that we were often treated as men, just smaller men, and how we were treated in healthcare. And that is part of this equity journey, right? Is to relearn how we do things, is to make sure that the education is not only in the system, right, of medical education, but that is in its residency programs, and it's considered a competency even farther out when we think about like continuing medical credits in education.
Awesome, thanks for that response. We also had a lot of positive response in the chat, including those who said they were looking forward to seeing some of these efforts trickle down the ladder to medical personnel who are providing direct patient service. Can you talk a little bit more about the reaction to this work in line with our positive reaction, especially by AMA members. It sounds like they are behind you and supporting this work.
I mean, we have 270,000 plus members. I will tell you, just like anything else you do, we haven't had all positive response. Some people are harder to move than others, and some people don't think racism or equity is a primary concern. So we have our naysayers too. We also have our naysayers that will say, or not even our naysayers, we have those who challenge us, which is always good to have people challenge you to be better. Said, why isn't there more? When is there more? I'll believe when I see it. And that is fair and what we need too. We need to be challenged to do better, right? Because that is important. I think the other thing is we didn't talk about it. I didn't name it here, but when we talk about the personnel, part of it is also discussing equity when we talk about physician supremacy, right? All of us on these calls and a part of this have worked in kind of at our best worked at these multi-tiered medical or healthcare teams that can support families and communities where they are. And that's what we need. And part of that is understanding our roles in that work, how we can work with each other, but also meeting communities where they're at, right? And so the needs are for those centering voices of those most marginalized and minoritized and not centering the voices of those in power. And in this case, it would be physicians, even teaching them how to do that, right? How do they come to the table with that?
Awesome. Thank you. Sounds like you guys are aware of how multifaceted this all is. One question I had for you in particular is there one thing about this work that has surprised you? I know you've worked in health equity and around this for a long time, but is there one thing that kind of undertaking this and as it's been going that really kind of caught you off guard or something that you weren't expecting?
So I was very lucky to work with many of you who were on this phone when I first entered into the breastfeeding, as we call it, the first food world, right? Nearly 15 years ago. I had worked in maternal and child health, and my first thing was like, well, it's breastfeeding. Of course they teach this, just like one of the questions, right? Of course, medical physicians, medical people know this. We know this. We all know this is what they have to do, and how people didn't know. I found the same point when I started this equity work at AMA. I have been a public health professional my whole life. My goal has always been social justice. Health is my medium. And I will tell you, there was never at one point in my career that I was like, I hope someday I'll get to work with a bunch of physicians at the American Medical Association, right? And so what I learned too is if any of you get our hands, and you should, I encourage you to read our strategic plan and hold us accountable to those things. It is 82 pages. And anybody who's written a strategic plan knows that strategic plans aren't 82 pages. But we had to meet, Jackie, to your point, we had to meet physicians where they were. And that is a long arc, right? We had to put all of this history down. We had to put it all in writing. And is it a first step? 2 weeks ago, there was no documentation of AMA's contributions to the inequities in our systems written down, and then no commitments to how we're moving forward. That's different today. And so what I was most surprised about is the work that we have to do, but willing to do that work. And so I am both very excited of the people who have come forward who said we want to be part of this. And I'm also very excited of those who are challenging us to say, that's great. The proof is in the pudding. So it's continuous work. And I am also, so everyone knows on this call, I am also very humbled and probably very pleased at how many of our medical students at AMA are challenging these norms and these narratives, that they are coming up and saying, this is how it has to be. This is why I'm practicing medicine, because I want to be part of supporting communities, and I can't do it alone. So how do we do this together?
Well, that's awesome to hear. Do you think, in terms of sort of this you have multiple generations within your membership, I'm sure. Do you find that it's really the younger generations of physicians who are driving some of these conversations for their superiors and mentors, or do you feel like there is a lot of intergenerational dialogue that's happening with members?
So I'm a strong believer, and I'm no longer in that group, right? That the youth will lead us. I think the youth are invested in their futures. And sometimes as we get older, we go, oh, these youth, they just don't care. I think the medical students are challenging it, and I think they have allies throughout, right? Whichever generation they mean. But as a group, when we say, let's get to A, they're like, that's great. How about we make a plan to get to F, step F? And then A will seem like nothing. And so the constant challenge is good, right? Like the constant challenge is to be better and be part of something. I think as a membership organization, and you should think about, organizations of the function with us, as a membership organization, it is imperative that the AMA listen to its up and coming members, right? So that is a driving force too. They recognize their power, and their power is, if you want me to be a member for my long career as a physician, you will listen to me now. So I think that does give me a lot of hope and a lot of faith. And um, I'm very comforted that it's not all fixed, but that there's a willingness, right? And that there's a real commitment to do something, that it's not just kind of like, I heard this in medical school. It's kind of like, no, all of these things happen. We have Black men in white coats. We have the understanding of physicians for Black Lives Matter. So we're moving in that, like any group. But having been on the outside of public health professionals, being back with physicians, I'm glad I have some colleagues and some advocates in there too.
In regard to sort of moving our hope from A to actually let's shoot for F, you talked a lot about these levers of change. Is there one that you feel is particularly key to moving this health equity agenda forward, or that you feel is currently sort of underdeveloped as part of your plan?
So AMA, those of you who know the American Medical Association, that has a huge advocacy arm. And getting that muscle right is really key, right? It had definitely impacts in the Civil Rights Act and the Hill-Burton, separate but equal. It'll have definite say in, it had ACA and where it stood on that. So our advocacy arm and recognizing our advocacy work. So for instance, AMA just wrote in support of the Moms Act, was part of the amicus briefs with getting rid of the ban on methanol cigarettes. Understanding, right, what your role is and your power structures in there is really important. So for AMA, our advocacy and our lobbying work and making sure that equity is part of those things is one of our strongest levers. If we can have our advocacy team understand that work, if we can have our advocacy committee and the House of Delegates understand that, how they can integrate it, it's that first question I said, how do you operationalize it? Like, what's missing? Whose voice is missing? Who's hurt by this happening? But just by asking those questions can change the trajectory of how that work has happened. So I think that is really the opportunity. Those of you who've been following AMA know that we also have a lot of work to do. JAMA and the incident that's happened there, we're still waiting for an independent committee to come back with what had happened. And while JAMA had independent authority, right, and oversight, journalistic oversight. So as the Center of Health Equity had nothing a part of it, that was still in our own house. So we have to take responsibility for that and say, how do we move forward with that too? So there's the supremacy of, and those of you who have ever written for a journal, right, and get publications know about the supremacy of that, what gets published and what becomes best practice and the reality of that. So I think developing that too and understanding that is probably an area I would like to see more developed keenly by all journals, but also the Journal of Health Ethics, at AMA and the Journal of American Medical Association itself.
So we have about a minute or two left. Is there anything else that has stood out that you didn't get to share today, or that you feel like people who are, as most of us attending this talk are really invested in this health equity work, advice or additional things that you'd like to share?
I would say that we're looking for partners in this journey. That the American Medical Association, part of this work is those building alliances and sharing power. And you don't know what you don't know, right? So I look forward to working with many of you on the phone as we think about opportunities that didn't exist before because we didn't even feign to dream that they could happen, and challenging organized medicine to meet us where we're at, right? I think that that's really important. I thank you for your time on this, and I'm happy to join you for vacation. I apologize if I talked very fast and stumbled through this, but I'm always available to talk more about the work that we can do.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time.